Hey, what is up guys, JTX here. Today I'm bringing you one of the last builds I'm doing for Ancestor League. Probably one of the most expensive builds that I've done. Normally I try not to do crazy expensive builds so people can actually try follow along. For this type of build, it's more of a nostalgia trip based off a really old build that existed all the way back in Delve League. There used to be something called an Abberath Autobomber where you would use a pair of boots called Abberath's Hooves to allow you to actually kill mobs and chain explosions. This is one of my favorite builds of all time. Probably one of the most fun builds that I've ever played in PoE. It kind of fell, out of favor with some of the new Autobomber builds and the new tech, and I just really wanted to give this build another life, at least with all the new techs and new gear currently in 3.23. This kind of build is the amalgamation of that. You'll notice that a lot of the gear here is pretty expensive, but you kind of do need this type of investment to get the power to replicate the old days for this type of build. Now, the original build was done by a player called myself. I'll have his channel linked and also the old video. It was a Abberath Autobomber that was an Elementalist that used to use the old Elementalist Beacon of Ruin, which lets you proliferate all your effects. So you get this crazy amount of clear, and you use a Inpulsa. Now, to talk about the interaction between how Inpulsa works, Inpulsa was one of the first items in the game that gave you a source of explode. Before any of the synthesis explode or the Elder Slayer mod explodes, it was one of the few sources of explode in the game. Now, the reason why explode was so powerful back in the day was it allowed you to reliably chain and clear packs of mobs, especially with Herald skills like Herald of Ice. Now, with Inpulsa, it has a very specific condition that stops us from being ridiculously overpowered. It's just in shocked enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their life as lightning damage, which cannot shock, okay? So this stops you from getting the chain explosions straight away, like you see now with most physical explode builds, where they can chain off itself. So if you kill an enemy with Inpulsa regularly, the enemy will explode, dealing their life as lightning damage. That damage cannot shock, so that thing can't also explode, okay? So you can't chain your explosions. There is a very cool interaction you can do with, you can see Cold Brotherhood here. It converts up to 48% of your lightning damage into cold damage, okay? And after you've converted your damage into cold, that cold damage can shock with Ascendancy, which is Shaper of Storms, which makes all damage can shock. So what ends up happening is with your Inpulsa explosion, by converting it into cold, your thing can explode. So when it explodes, it does cold damage, and then that cold damage can shock, which can then in turn trigger an Inpulsa again, which then can explode again, and then you get the idea, it kind of proliferates and chains. The more AoE you scale into it, the bigger your explosions are. That's probably what you're seeing at the start of the video, as well as the showcase throughout the video, that the build has insane clear potential because of Inpulsa. Inpulsa was the OG explode item in the game. It's kind of been power crept out now by a bunch of other items, but I think bringing it back here just to give it a showcase of some of the newer players of how good Inpulsa was, I think it's a nice trip down memory lane. Now, the character itself is pretty straightforward. You're pretty much trying to scale the Herald damage of your Herald of Thunder and your Herald of Ice, okay? It's essentially an Autobomber that uses those two skills. A caveat that most people don't know is it's very hard to scale Herald damage. It's also the reason why making Herald Autobomber builds has become much harder in the current day with how things have scaled and how much Heralds have been left behind in terms of what you can scale with. Heralds can't scale with Aura Effect. Heralds can't scale with spell damage. Heralds count as buffs. So there's very specific things that can actually scale the damage of Heralds. So mostly it's generic elemental damage or like generic cold, fire, lightning damage can scale the damage. And also items like Annihilating Light, which gives you more elemental, triple damage with elemental skills. So there's quite a limited amount of sources that you can actually scale the damage. The best way we actually get damage, surprisingly, is actually running some added lightning damage or added cold damage gems to our setups just to give the base hit of the Herald a lot more damage. The reason why this is, I would call, one of the last true Autobomber builds is simply because you can have no skills at all and the build will still function. Not many builds these days can do that. So for example, RF, you have to turn RF at the start of the map. For the Herald of Thunder builds, you have to shock something to start your Storm Secret loop. For the Herald of Thunder Giga damage builds, all of those builds require you actually having to do something in order to trigger the build. This build, I can turn every single skill off right now just to have my, just simply having my move skill. And I can go, let's say, into a Demo Aqueduct, and the build will work fine. So I don't touch anything, okay? No skills at all equipped. Until when I hit a pack of mobs, the build starts functioning by itself. And this is very rare for a lot of builds these days because you have to have an activation condition, while this build's activation condition is pretty much run into a pack and kill something. So it's very easy to get the build going. So to explain the mechanics of the build, it's based around a pair of boots called Abberath's Hooves. Abberath's Hooves is a unique item that gives you a skill as soon as it's equipped that automatically triggers when you walk around. So you can see this fiery explosion as my character walks around. That's granted by the Abberath's Fury. So how this works is every time you take a step, you'll create a little explosion at your feet, and you can use the gem links inside the boots to scale the damage, or the AoE, or whatever you want of the Abberath's Fury. What you add here is like you add in some, let's say, add a lightning, add a cold, just to give it a good amount of base damage, and then your boots will allow you to kill things when you enter maps. And then essentially, as soon as you kill the very first mob, it'll activate both your Herald of Thunder to get your Herald of Thunder getting your single target damage up, and it'll also proc your Herald of Ice because we have a very, very high chance to freeze when we kill things. And then once you proc Herald of Ice, it'll shatter, like making your Herald of Ice explode, and then Inpulsa will go off and everything will chain because you're both shocking and freezing at the same time. So that's how you get these ridiculous chains without doing anything at all. You're pretty much running around and packs are blowing up. I'll go over the skill tree here. I'm going to make a note right here that this build obviously is not going to be the cheapest build to run. It's a lot of investment to buy a lot of new tech and a new unique jewels and passive tree shenanigans that lets you get to this point, but I think it can be done with a lot less investment. The main thing is just to get your impulses plus your Cult Brotherhoods. This just allows the build to be a little bit more flexible in how you build this damage and also how you build this survivability. We'll start off with the actual Ascendancy. So we're going an Elementalist here simply because we want Shaper of Storms. You can also do this potentially as a occultist because you can just take the Shaper of Storms Ascendancy node with your Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh. That's also an option. I personally like Elementalist because we have the built-in Heart of Destruction, so we get 60% increased AoE while you don't have conversion. So this is a massive boost in our clear, as well as we get a free shield here, Bastion of Elements, which helps with the survivability of the build. The reason why survivability might be an issue with the build is most of the gear that you may have noticed is unique. Fixing our defenses is a little bit annoying on the build, so those are the things you have to consider. If you do want to try it as a occultist, I think it's very possible to do a crit version with power charge scaling. For my purposes, the OG build was Elementalist, and this current build will also be Elementalist, just to keep it in the theme of having a build taken from the past into the present. For the skill tree itself, we're running a lot of cluster setups because cluster setups are what give us the most value for our heralds, because like I said before, not a lot of things can actually scale the herald damage. So what we're looking for here is increased cold damage, large cluster jewel here with Blast Freeze, Prismatic Heart, and Widespread Destruction. We're only allocating Blast Freeze and Prismatic Heart. The Widespread Destruction is optional. It just forces Prismatic Heart and Blast Freeze to be the closer two nodes, so you don't have to go all the way to the top to allocate it. On the other two clusters is Prismatic Heart, Snowstorm, and Widespread Destruction. Once again, we care about Snowstorm and Prismatic Heart. The Widespread Destruction is also a nice node, but we don't have to take it because it is 2 extra additional points if we can use that for other things. Keep a note that we do want Widespread Destruction on this final node here, so we get access to Snowstorm and Prismatic Heart on the 2 closer nodes. For the medium clusters we're running some Herald clusters here. One of these is Self-Fulfilling Prophecy and Empowered Envoy. You might be wondering why I'm running Self-Fulfilling Prophecy if you're not a crit build. By default, Herald skills do not have any crit strike counts at all, or very low, if any. The reason why you have to run Self-Fulfilling Prophecies is because of this node here, your Elemental Overload. With this keystone, you have to crit in the past 8 seconds, and you'll deal 40% more damage for 8 seconds. It's really, really strong for a build like this because it's elemental damage, so it actually affects the herald damage. And getting just a little bit of crit is enough in the build because you'll be hitting fast enough in the 8 seconds that you'll trigger it pretty consistently. So you're looking for around 3 to 4% crit chance on your Herald of Thunder, and that should be enough just to give you the procs for your Elemental Overload. And that's generally what you want. Note that Elemental Overload, from my understanding, is per skill. So if you crit with Herald of Thunder, it doesn't mean your Herald of Ice will do more damage. Likewise, if you crit with your Herald of Ice, doesn't mean your Herald of Thunder does more damage. Each one of your skills has to actually trigger the crit to actually make it do more damage. But in general, you just want your Herald of Thunder to proc it because that's your single target. Your Herald of Ice will always clear things regardless because of your Impulso explosion. So not too worried about the Herald of Ice being able to get the Elemental Overload, but more importantly, your Herald of Thunder gets the Elemental Overload. So these are the 2 nodes you want to run: Empowered Envoy, so increased damage with Heralds, and also 20% increased effective Herald buffs on you. Alternatively, you can also run some other Herald classes as well. Other acceptable ones could also be a Dark Messenger with Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. Just as long as you have a little bit of crit in your notables, you can run anything as your other node if you want. So Dark Messenger is fine, Empowered Envoy is fine. And the other set of clusters we're running, Area Damage clusters, medium. So we're running Assert Dominance and Towering Threat. You notice that this gives us a lot of AoE if we kill 5 enemies in the last 5 seconds. This build is designed as a really, really, really fast mapper, a very, very mind-numbing mapper. Not much to think about. You pretty much pop the character in, run, everything will die. And the more area we get on this, the better it is. I'll get into some of the jewels we're running here in this build. So we're running a Blood Notch with a Immutable Force combo. So this combo has been around since last league. If you get stunned, the damage from that stun gets recovered to you as life. And combined with a Progenesis, it makes this build actually really tanky to lots of medium-sized hits. And the only thing we're really scared about is really large hits. So for general purpose mapping, it makes the build really survivable. We're also running a Glorious Vanity for our Timeless Jewel. This is in the name of Doyani, so it gives us Corrupted Soul. This just gives us a bit of extra ES from our life pool. Before actually running Eldritch Battery, I was using the Corrupted Soul to protect my life to give us even more tankiness. I only recently switched to Eldritch Battery because I wanted to run a Hatred setup with Divine Blessing just to give us some more damage. You could easily just have Corrupted Soul without Eldritch Battery. It's not needed. I just added it in because I realized my build was tanky enough and I wanted a bit more damage in the build. And having the Energy Shield as my mana also made it a bit easier for actually setting up my active skills like Phase Run or Flame Dash. Obviously, you can just not take Eldritch Battery and have an additional like 700, 800 Energy Shield to protect your life. The reason why we also take Corrupted Soul is it has some decent notables here. So I've gotten Ritual of Stillness and Revitalizing Frost, noting that the Call of the Brotherhoods convert most of our damage to cold. This is some nice extra damage. Also a bit of Leech from us for the cold damage leads its life. And you kind of want to look for a Glorious Vanity with decent other travel nodes. For example, this Chaos Res. This is AoE here, more cold damage, skill effect duration, more cold damage, and AoE again. So just look for a Timeless Jewel with some decent travel nodes, but mainly you want the Corrupted Soul so you get a bit more extra ES either for Eldritch Battery or just to protect your life. And look for some decent notables here, ideally very close. It's pretty flexible what nodes you actually go for with your Glorious Vanity. Just try to get Corrupted Soul so you get either a nice ES pool for your Eldritch Battery or a ES pool for your life. Over here we're running a Impossible Escape. This is for the Hexmaster node here, so we can actually allocate nodes within the radius of this keystone. This is just to save some points for grabbing Heart of Ice, Breath of Rhyme, and Static Blows. All these are really powerful nodes for the build. Both lightning and cold damage is really good because we scale cold damage and lightning gets converted to cold. This also gives us increased effect of lightning elements, which makes our shocks more effective. This is a really decent node because increasing your shock also increases your damage by quite a bit because you're guaranteed at least a 15% shock here with Shaper of Storms. Other than that, we're also running a Grand Spectrum setup. So we're running Grand Spectrum with increased elemental damage per Grand Spectrum, increased endurance charges per Grand Spectrum for a bit of extra defense, increased life per Grand Spectrum to give us a bit more life into the build because this build is a little bit life starved with how our passive tree splits across just to grab these clusters. For Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh, I'm running Frigid Wake. This is actually a really powerful Ascendancy from the Occultist, which lets us get 15% more cold damage. It also lets us freeze enemies for 0.4 seconds every 4 seconds, so this guarantees that we can actually get some of the freeze effect from our Heat Shiver off, as well as giving us a guaranteed source of freeze. It's really powerful, especially for juiced mapping, because it gives you a temporary window of safety when you freeze things around you. And with our tree, we do scale a bit of freeze duration, so we get a bit of freeze duration from here, Winter's Embrace, and we also get a bit of freeze duration from Breath of Rhyme. It gives us time, if we don't kill it straight away, that mobs are pretty much frozen permanently until we do kill them. Really powerful, especially with Blast Freeze as well. With freezes, you inflict spreading to other enemies within 1.2 meters. So essentially, you just freeze the whole pack of mobs, and then your explosion will come and kill everything. Most of the time, mobs are frozen until they die. For our Watcher's Eye, I've grabbed a Watcher's Eye with Onslaught on kill, more affected by haste. This is essentially just a little bit more movement speed as we get around the map. We don't really care about the attack speed or the cast speed from Onslaught. And we also have Chaos Res, we're affected by Purity of Elements. This makes it less dangerous to have poison on our builds, be a little bit more flexible with our Pantheon. Potentially, you could run Soul of Valakesh here, so moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take extra damage. For our tattoos, we're just looking for all stats, plus mana reservation where possible. The build is a little bit stat starved because of some of the dex gems we run, specifically Phase Run and Haste. So we do want to pick up stats where we can, noting that a lot of the gear is not very flexible, so we want to run stats where possible. And that kind of sums up the passive tree. It's just a very generic elemental damage scaling passive tree. So quickly jumping into Path of Building just to see the build itself. We're sitting around 4.95 million damage on the Herald of Thunder. I think that's more than enough for endgame mapping. Obviously, this character is not meant to be a uber bosser or any of those crazy bossing characters. It's just enough damage to clear tier 16s pretty comfortably, as well as kill any juice content that you might have. If you go to the configs page here, just a couple settings, make sure you have ticked. Obviously, is the enemy exposed to cold? Have that ticked because we'll be exposing always with our gloves. Is the enemy shocked? We'll always be shocked because of our Ascendancy. is the enemy frozen / chilled with the amount of damage we're hitting with, and also our freeze chance. 90% of the time, enemy's going to be frozen. Other configs as well that you can turn on. You can also turn on frenzy charges because our ice bite will be generated. Note that these will also be taken away by your phase run, so you won't always have this up. But just note that you can have frenzy charges, it's just that they aren't reliably on all the time. We set our effective chill to 15% with the max being 30. I think 15% is a very conservative estimate. We are hitting pretty damn hard with the Herald of Thunder. We're hitting about 1.1 million average hit, so we will be hitting the max chill on most enemies in maps. And we're also ticking his enemy on consecrated ground because of Bottled Faith. You also take heavy shock on enemy recently. You also take shattered enemy recently. Both of these a little bit extra damage. We also do anoint Charisma on our amulet just for a bit of extra mana res. I'll go over my gear now. Like I said before, this is one of my end league characters, so normally I don't dump this much currency into a character. For this case, I really wanted this to be a really fun build and make it work. To address the elephant in the room, yes, we're running a Headhunter. Headhunter is actually really powerful for this build because of how the way the build ramps. It makes the build incredibly fast, tanky, does a lot of damage, and also gives a lot of strength and dex, which is kind of like a meme people say for giving it dex, but genuinely having the extra stats helps in this build because we're a little bit stat starved. Alternatively, if you don't have a Headhunter early on, you could slot in a couple of inspired learnings, and you can run a Stygian Advice with stat life resistances just to help you out early on. And then if you do get a Headhunter eventually, that's when your build really starts kicking into gear. Other gear in the build, for the amulet, we're also running a Ashes of the Stars. This gives gives us a lot of reservation efficiency as well as quality to skill gems. I would highly recommend getting a replica Dragon Fang's Flight with Herald of Thunder gems before you get an upgrade like this. That amulet is also really good because it gives you +3 levels to Herald of Thunder, which is a crazy amount of damage, and also gives you a bit of reservation efficiency for a fraction of the cost. I still think Ashes of the Stars is really powerful for the build because of the quality of all skill gems, because you can run a bunch of cool skill gems in this build, and getting the extra quality on the alternate gems is actually really powerful. Obviously in the rings, double Call of the Brotherhood with the elemental damage catalyst. So this catalyst makes your elemental damage go from 40% lightning conversion to 48. So with 2 of these rings, you're converting 96% of your lightning damage to cold. Really powerful. In the chest piece, Inpulsa's Broken Heart, a classic chest piece from a bygone era. Try get it with extra gem levels, so either AoE gems, duration gems, or Socketer gems to make your Herald of Thunder as high as possible. So my current Herald of Thunder is 29. Potentially push it to 31 or 32 if you have Awakened Power or you have like a +1/+2 chest. For our purposes though, it's more than enough damage as a mapper. I've cleared up to 80% Delirious maps with this build and it functions fine. At that point, you're more worried about your defenses rather than your offenses. In your gloves, this is one of the few rare pieces of gear that you run. It's just a pair of resistance and life gloves with the 2 Inpulsa mods being very important. The first being cold exposure on hit. This is actually really powerful with your Elementalist node, Mastermind of Discord, because any exposure you apply gets an extra 25%. So if you're applying exposure here at -12, you're getting an additional 25, making you 37% minus the cold res. And you can also grab a mastery here. So for any time you expose, you inflict at least 18. So this thing doesn't have to be a high level at all. We can leave it at like lesser, at like 11%. And the mastery will kick it up to 18% straight away because of how it works, allowing you to inflict cold exposure on every single hit you do with your build. The other mode that's really important is shocks you inflict spread to other enemies within 1.6 meters. This just lets the shock from our impulses proliferate a lot easier, and also it allows us to chain those explosions to a really far degree. This kind of simulates whatever the elemental Ascendancy node was before, just let elements proliferate. This kind of simulates that, because you do want everything to proliferate your shock, so your Herald of Thunder and your Herald of Ice, even your Abberath's Hooves, just allowing things to proliferate the shock. It's really powerful to get those chains going. In our weapon slot, we're running an Annihilating Light. This has an increased AoE corrupt. You can also stay with the block, doesn't have to be AoE. Obviously look for a low roll one, so you don't gimp your resistances by a crazy amount. This is really powerful for the build because very few things scale the damage of Heralds, elemental damage being one of them. So having triple damage makes the build actually viable to do enough damage with your Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice. Kind of a no-brainer. It makes the build a little bit harder to cap your resistances. We'll get to that point in a second. The last piece of gear to cover is Heat Shiver. Heat Shiver is really powerful because of all the cold damage we're doing. We gain that as fire damage, and because of how much we're hitting with our Herald of Thunder, we're actually getting a really high chill effect against enemies. Most of the time we'll be hitting max chill effect, and we'll also be freezing most enemies, because of our freeze chance on our build, on our passive tree. So having a heat shiver is actually a huge damage multiplier. I believe it's 30 to 40% more damage for the build. Alternatively, you can also run a mana reservation helmet. So I actually crafted one for the build. So obviously you're looking for Herald of Thunder has increased mana reservation efficiency because this is your 6th link. This is where most of your mana is going to be reserved from. This helmet can also be used to help with your resistances and your life. You do lose a little bit of damage for it, but generally it should be okay because you're just taking it as a mapping character. So this is also a viable alternative as a helmet. So on your implicit, you have mana res and increased AoE. Obviously for your champion on heat shiver, you do want Herald of Thunder mana reservation efficiency. For our flasks, we're running a Writhing Jar. This jar is actually very strategic because, like I said before, to get the build going, you need to be killing something so your Herald of Thunder can actually proc based on what it says here. So you create a storm when you kill a shocked enemy. Since we always shock with our Ascendancy, when we create a worm, a flask here, and we run over it with our Abberath, we'll trigger our Herald of Thunder. This lets it be up during boss fights, so if there are no mobs around, the Herald of Thunder might disappear if you don't kill it within 6.42 seconds. So if that duration times out, you can just pop a worm flask, kill a worm, your Herald of Thunder will start up again. So that just gives you a bit more time to kill bosses. Normally it won't matter because you're ramping really fast and your builds just zoom in through the map. This is just a kind of, break jar in case of emergency if you really do need extra time for your Herald of Thunder to kill bosses. Running a Bismuth flask here with additional elemental resistances, you will note that our resistances are not capped when we don't have this flask up. It's actually very hard to cap the reses in this build, just due to the sheer number of uniques we're wearing. If we pop our flask though, we do get to a capped elemental resistances. I have noticed this being an issue ever during maps because we're always killing things constantly with the build pretty much running around just non-stop blowing up screens. This is why the flask is really important. It is 13 seconds, so it is quite a long time, and it has 40 charges. And obviously we put the enchant for use flask charges reach full because we're extra lazy. There's nothing else we have to press when the build starts. All of these flasks will begin to pop as soon as we start killing packs. Same thing for this, Quicksilver with movement speed on it. Progenesis, this just gives us a more beefed up life pool to let us survive some of the more smaller hits that we take or medium hits we take in mapping. Really useful to make the build feel a little bit smoother. And the final flask is a Sulfur Flask, Bottled Faith. This is one of the few sources that can also increase our Herald of Thunder and lightning damage. Just gives us 10% increased damage taken to enemies during consecrated ground. Also gives us a bit of crit chance to help us proc our elemental overload. For our Pantheons, we're running a Soul of Arakali. So this is just mainly for the chaos damage. We're a little bit scared of DOTs on this build. There are a few ways to address this. One of these is just to run a Soul of Arakali to reduce chaos damage over time. And for our Minor God, depending on what the content you're doing, you can run Abberath so you're not affected by burning ground. You can run Rislatha if you want to keep your Writhing Jar flasks up constantly. You can even run Shikari if you're worried about poison damage. It's really dependent on the content you're running and what you're immune to. Speaking of your immunities, if you do really want to min-max the build, you can get Corrupts on rings, being one of them is bleeding cannot be inflicted upon you, the other one being poison cannot be inflicted upon you. These are both available as corruptions for Call of the Brotherhood. They're a little bit pricey respectively, but they make you immune to DOTs. And the only really DOTs you should be scared of is maybe lightning DOTs or cold DOTs. But generally, the build functions fine against those. It's mainly you've got to watch out for the bleeds and poisons. They're the ones that might get you in the build. Now to the meat and potatoes of the build, we'll talk about the gem links. For our 6th link Herald of Thunder, this is our main damage setup. Running Herald of Thunder attached to Empower. So Empower gets +1 from the chest, so it's level 5. We get Elemental Penetration support. We get Awaken Added Lightning damage support. The Awaken Added Lightning gives us extra gem. This is a lightning skill gem, so it makes our Herald of Thunder even higher. At gem levels is always good on Herald skills because it's very hard to scale damage. Divergent Hypothermia and Anomalous Cruelty support just to give us more damage with hits. In our glove slot, we're running our auras, so we're running Haste linked to Divergent Purity of Elements and Flame Dash with Enlighten. We need the Purity of Elements to help us cap our reses. Without it, it gets very hard and complicated to cap. Also having the Divergent Purity gives us a little extra pen, as well as making us immune to ailments, which is really powerful. We don't have to worry about freeze, ignites, or shocks, which is really handy for the build. In our actual boots, supporting Abberath's Fury, we have Anomalous Elemental Proliferation support. This just gives us additional chance to freeze, shock, and ignite. We want to get our chance to freeze as high as possible because we're always shocking anyway. We also want to freeze so we can trigger our Herald of Ice. That's linked to Anomalous Hypothermia. This also gives 20% chance to freeze enemies which are chilled. Awaken Added Lightning damage and Awaken Added Cold. Both of these are just damage links to make sure once we actually run into a map, the Abberath's Fury does damage for us to kill a pack of mobs, so we start the chain of our Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice going. In our weapon, it's very utility based, so we have Herald of Ice with Ice Bite and Awakened AoE. So these affect the Herald of Ice, so we get bigger explosions with our Herald of Ice, whilst also giving us frenzy charges when we kill enemies. The frenzy charges are important because we're running a phase run and ink duration support, so the phase run duration gets extended for each frenzy charge we consume, and the Ice Spider is giving us a bit of damage to Herald of Ice and also gives us the frenzy charges. We're also running an Ellie weakness plus Arcanist brand setup. This is mainly just for single target damage, so if you really want additional single target damage, you can just drop it down on bosses when we actually want single target. So we drop it down and it's for a bit of single target. And we also do the same with our Anomalous Hatred plus Divine Blessing. We just pop our Hatred and our Arcanist brand, and that ramps up our damage by double against single target. Normally it's not needed, it's mainly for like your Delirium Coasters bosses or Legion Generals. Drop this for a bit more damage, just so you can ramp it up a bit. Also, if you want to make the map boss a little bit quicker, you can drop these as well. This build has been really fun to play. It's a really big throwback to the nostalgia back when the build was available in Delve League. I really wanted to capture the essence of a true Autobomber again, just a build that you can just run along and blow things up. I think it's performed exactly how I wanted it to. It's allowed me to do a tier 16 map strategy, Delirium, juiced maps, Legion, a bit of everything. I can handle it pretty comfortably. I do think part of that obviously is carried by the fact that a Headhunter is really powerful for the build. Obviously there are a lot of cool mappers out there that can probably be a bit cheaper, or magic finders. I think this is just a very cool alternative to all those builds that exist already, and I think it's a really fun build to play. I definitely think you guys should check it out if you have some currency to spare, as well as if you really want to feel a true Autobomber. I think this could be the build for you if you really don't like pressing buttons. As always guys, I appreciate you guys watching the videos. Really happy to keep making content, especially for builds I'm passionate about, builds that are lesser known. I'll be playing this build for a couple more days. You can catch me at twitch.tv/JTX if you want to ask me any questions about the build, or if you just want to hang out and see what the build is about. I will be streaming there occasionally, so be sure to check in. You can also join my Discord server to get notifications when I'm live. Appreciate all the support you guys have been giving. Be sure to drop a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to keep up to date, and I will catch you guys in the next video.